but also around the US. And we wanted to talk to you specifically about microaggressions. To begin with, we want to start with a common ground. What is a microaggression, and how do they work?
Mm-hmm. So microaggressions are often subtle or sometimes unintentional types of behaviors or responses towards individuals from minority groups often that can implicitly or unconsciously, automatically show negative responses to those individuals. So for example, if you're sitting next to someone who's not from the same racial group as you, you may not sit as close to them. You may not smile as much. In some cases, you may accidentally say something that you wouldn't, that you don't intend to be racially biased, but just because of a simple lack of understanding about the differences or having a sensitivity towards those differences, it can come off to that individual from that outgroup or minority group as being hostile or negative towards their group.
Okay. One of the things I found very interesting about this debate is like the dilemma that seems to be between like free expression and the defense of someone's vulnerability to be protected, right? Mm-hmm. So what's the balance that you think there must be between these two things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think often people have really good intentions about many of these conversations that they have. And I think creating a space where people feel like they can be included in the conversation and be allowed to be wrong or be allowed to make a mistake about their understanding about group differences, I think that is healthy. And create a dialogue between individuals, I think, is very important. Now, I think some of the problem comes when individuals, by trying to maybe not talk about sensitive subjects or by trying to, reduce people's discomfort, they may protect individuals from discussing these kinds of things openly in classrooms or debating them in public spaces. And that, I think, sometimes can come across as not being productive for reducing these kinds of intergroup differences that we see. So, as a minority individual, you are in a world where you're going to encounter people that may have different views than you. And oftentimes, being able to learn to operate in that space, I think, can be difficult, but ultimately can have benefits for society. Now, I also think it's, in terms of from an educator's perspective, I think it's important for educators to think about the way in which they present material or even the way in which they include individuals in the conversations that they have about certain material. So in classrooms, I think sometimes people don't realize that they're only covering the majority group's perspective and the types of readings they're assigning, or they're not trying to engage in these tough conversations about difference. And I think when they do try to do that, they should do so with respect to those individuals. So oftentimes I think when some students, could feel tokenized in classrooms if they're asked to constantly be the one to speak up about, well, how does the woman in the room feel about women's inclusion in math and science? And that can be, I think, very difficult for some students, and professors and teachers and educators should be aware of these kinds of things when they're having these conversations.
The practical stuff, I think it's really important. I want to talk first about like that, and then I will like to know also what studies are about like all this discussion. But one of the things, for example, I as a foreigner like feel, for example, the place I come from, I'm from Mexico, we have another vision of free expression. We are sometimes kind of more open to say things because there is all this context maybe of where we have to be very aware of we are saying. So coming here to the US, for example, in my personal case, have two parts. One, the part of people should speak their mind. It's relevant overall in a context of when you should feel, for example, in a school, where you should feel safe to say what you want, and sometimes to your friends be candid about what you say, even using sometimes black humor, right? And that's something that can be assessed as a microaggression at some point, but maybe in a private context, it's just the way two peers are like hanging out. But the other part is I am here opposite as I am in Mexico. I am here a minority. And it was pretty curious because one time I have this conversation with an American, and it was pretty fun in the sense that we were talking three persons, and one of them says Guatemala. Yeah, I don't remember what we were talking, and the other guy said, "What is Guatemala?" And the American guy said something like, "It's like the Mexico's Mexico," and to me it was a pretty fun joke, but at the same time, I didn't know very well the person. So to me, the context in that particular moment mattered, and I felt uncomfortable. What do you think about like this discussion, but in terms of practical matters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, certainly context and culture matters a lot in dictating what people think is normative, right? What people think is okay to say to other people, and what you think is okay to say to your friends may be very different from what you think is okay to say to a stranger. I think a lot of people have described that kind of process of adjusting to these norms and the process of becoming, moving from a country and now becoming a minority in that country. And I think navigating those spaces can be very difficult for even people in the country who haven't had a lot of exposure to people who are not like them, right? So this is kind of where that microaggression thing comes in. So some people haven't had a lot of intergroup contact. They're actually not aware that some of these jokes might not be funny to a stranger. They might think it's actually bonding, or that they're trying to reach out and be funny and likable with that person. And so there actually is a bit of a learning curve about what the group says is okay to say about them and in these public spaces. And oftentimes college campuses are the first place that many people start intermixing and thinking more deeply about the kinds of conversations that people think are okay to have about their group.
Does this debate has to be a policy debate, or does this debate has to be more a campaign a debate about to be aware of what you can say or what you cannot say? Because it is important and relevant, like when we are speaking about a problem, that is something that we should speak up about. But the other thing, and very differently, is it a policy matter? Is it a public interest matter that maybe the government should have, or an authority like a university has something to say about?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the personal, because I think that's an easier question to tackle a bit. So, intention matters, and I think people want to be nice to each other on average. Most people probably want to be nice to people. And part of that is learning to navigate what they find to be acceptable and not acceptable, right? And so intention, like in the context of the joke, really mattered, right? So that person's intention wasn't to hurt the person by saying that particular joke. They were potentially trying to be affiliative, right? And so it's very different to, with intent, say something hostile or negative. And I think that in a public space can be something that if you genuinely are curious about groups and group differences, it's something you should try to figure out. What do people think is okay for other people to talk about in relation to their own group, and the kinds of jokes that are okay. Now, of course, that can be very difficult, right? There's a lot of group differences in the world. From a policy standpoint, it becomes, I think, a bit more difficult. So, legally there are statutes and laws that we have to abide by that help to mitigate some of these differences that we've seen based on group membership in the United States. And from a policy perspective, I think it is university and courts' responsibility to uphold those laws. Do I think it's the court's responsibility or courts or government agencies who are advancing policy, do I think that it's their responsibility to try to curb microaggressions on that level? From a policy level, I don't necessarily think so. I do think from a cultural level, it's really important. So I do think it is something important for a university to say, we want groups to feel comfortable and included in the conversations, and it's really important that we try to create a place where people can have a healthy debate. We can respect people's right to free speech, but we can do so with good intentions and trying to interact in the best way possible, right? And so that's different than saying we're going to create some rule at the university that's going to kick you out if, you violated microaggression policy that we have on campus. It'd be very difficult to even identify how you would, who would you target for something like that, or what would constitute that.
Does it exist any kind of research on what kind of interventions like this can help solve these little microaggressions or this problem of the microaggressions?
Well, there hasn't been a ton of work yet on microaggressions in terms of stereotyping and prejudice research. There has been a lot of work on looking at ways to decrease implicit biases, which are sort of these non-deliberate, unconscious associations that we have about different groups that can affect things like our nonverbal behavior towards them, how we feel about them, the kinds of thoughts we have about that group, the stereotypes we have about that group. And so implicit biases are often pretty resistant to long-term change. So there's actually been some recent research showing that the interventions that we typically have aren't very lasting. But there are some interventions that show promising temporary changes in these implicit racial biases. And those types of interventions involve things like intergroup contact, learning to try to think about individuals as individuals separate from their categories. So really trying to get to know someone and the personal characteristics about them. Perspective taking, or really thinking about how would I feel if I was in their shoes, if I was the one who had to face what they face on a daily basis. Those kinds of interventions have been very successful in temporarily mitigating implicit racial biases. And implicit racial biases are thought to relate to some of these microaggressions that we see, these kinds of micro-behavioral responses we see in daily life.
Since we're at the University of Chicago, I cannot skip this question. What data exists on the short-term and long-term effects of microaggressions?
What can you repeat that?
What data exist on the short-term and long-term effects of microaggressions?
On individuals. Well, individuals, both in the short term and in the long term, find microaggressions to be stressful and have a stress response to those sorts of aggressive microaggressions. And that can actually lead to long-term detriments in health. Having a long-term chronic stress response in an environment where you don't belong, where you feel like individuals, you're encountering these microaggressions in your daily life, can be bad for your physiology and your stress levels. Also, it can affect your sense of well-being and your sense of belonging. And so both of those things have shown changes in both the short term and the long term.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it. Thank you very much, Professor Jenny.